Consider the scenario. What if the global economy collapsed overnight? What if the United States entered a recession, triggering a domino effect that crushed entire countries? While this may sound extreme, the truth is that many nations are precariously positioned, relying heavily on the U.S. for their economic survival. Some depend significantly on American trade, while others have structured their economies around U.S. investments and exports. Consequently, when the U.S. economy stumbles, these countries could face complete collapse. You might be surprised to discover which nations are teetering on this brink. Join us as we explore the 10 countries that could face total collapse if the U.S. enters a recession. Number 10. Mexico. You might assume that Mexico is insulated from the impacts of a U.S. recession, but the depth of the connection between these two economies is quite striking. Billions of dollars in trade flow between the U.S. and Mexico annually, meaning a sudden economic downturn in America would devastate Mexico's economy. In 2023, approximately 80% of Mexico's exports were destined for the U.S., with cars, electronics, and agricultural products being the primary categories. A significant drop in U.S. consumer demand could send Mexico into a downward spiral, potentially leading rapidly to rising unemployment and widespread poverty. Furthermore, Mexico's growing dependence on remittances sent from workers in the U.S. has become a critical lifeline for many families. If U.S. wages decline, these vital financial transfers would likely slow considerably, leaving entire communities struggling to survive. The potential result is a country pushed to the edge of collapse. Number 9. Canada. Could Canada's reliance on the U.S. economy be the very factor jeopardizing its own survival? The extent of Canada's dependence on its southern neighbor is substantial. The U.S. stands as Canada's largest trading partner, with approximately 75% of Canadian exports heading south. Should the U.S. fall into a recession, Canada's economy would be severely impacted. One might think Canada could rely on its natural resources, but the reality is that oil prices are closely tied to American demand. A slowdown in the U.S. economy would likely push oil prices down, delivering a massive hit to Canada's vital oil sector. This downturn could also translate into significant job losses and potentially trigger a housing market crash. While Canada possesses strong social systems, the resulting economic strain could push the country toward a financial crisis, leaving millions scrambling for stability. It is questionable whether Canada could survive economically without its strong U.S. ties. Before we move on, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It's the best way to stay updated with more shocking, must-know content like this. Stay tuned because next, we're heading to South Korea, a country that could face a tech-driven collapse if the U.S. economy takes a hit. Number 8. South Korea. Have you ever considered how vulnerable a technology giant like South Korea might be to a U.S. recession? The interconnectedness of their economies is profound. South Korea is home to global powerhouses such as Samsung and Hyundai, and a vast portion of their exports head straight to the U.S. In 2023. Exports to the United States accounted for more than 14% of South Korea's GDP, particularly within the electronics and automotive industries. What happens if the U.S. economy falters? A sudden recession in the U.S. would dramatically reduce demand for South Korea's products. The semiconductor industry, South Korea's largest export sector, would face a severe downturn as American tech companies, which are major buyers of these chips, slash their budgets. Moreover, this would likely only be the beginning. The fallout wouldn't solely affect the tech sector but would ripple across the entire economy, potentially leading to massive job losses and widespread economic instability. The resulting financial strain could lead to a collapse of consumer confidence, triggering an economic domino effect. Imagine an entire nation of tech-savvy individuals facing layoffs, stagnant wages, and inflation due to diminished exports. South Korea's economic engine would stall, and the ripple effects could extend to other East Asian economies dependent on its exports. The question of whether South Korea could survive a U.S. recession looms large, representing a potential ticking time bomb. Number 7. Brazil. Consider the possibility that Brazil, the largest economy in South America, could be significantly destabilized by a U.S. recession. It might be surprising to learn just how dependent Brazil's economy is on the United States. Brazil's exports to the U.S. encompass a wide range, including soybeans, iron ore, and oil. However, when the U.S. economy experiences difficulties, countries like Brazil can face severe economic repercussions. In 2023, over 20% of Brazil's exports went to the United States, meaning any significant reduction in U.S. demand would have catastrophic effects on Brazil's economy. The agricultural sector, heavily reliant on American trade, would face a steep decline in profits. With unemployment already a concern in the country, a sudden downturn in trade would only exacerbate poverty and inequality. The potential shockwaves wouldn't stop there. Brazil's government debt has significantly increased, leaving the country vulnerable to economic shocks. If the U.S. enters a recession, global commodity prices would likely fall, severely impacting Brazil's oil exports. This would put enormous pressure on the Brazilian real, possibly leading to heightened inflation and widespread social unrest. Imagine a country already grappling with inequality and unemployment suddenly facing an economic collapse. Whether Brazil could navigate such a crisis remains highly uncertain. Before we move on, make sure to hit that subscribe button to keep up with more incredible, eye-opening content like this. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Next up, we'll dive into India, a country that relies heavily on U.S. outsourcing contracts. Stay tuned, because this could get wild. Number 6. India. What if India's massive outsourcing industry collapsed due to a U.S. recession? The extent to which India depends on the U.S. for its economic stability is striking. India's booming technology and service industries rely heavily on American contracts. In fact, nearly 60% of India's IT sector revenue originates from the United States, making it incredibly vulnerable to downturns there. So, what would happen if the U.S. entered a recession? A sudden slowdown in the U.S. economy would compel American companies to slash their IT budgets and reduce outsourcing. This would directly impact India's job market, especially in cities like Bengaluru and Hyderabad, where millions depend on tech outsourcing for their livelihoods. With reduced revenue flowing from the U.S., companies would be forced to lower salaries, cut jobs, and halt projects. The result could be a massive economic crisis for the millions of Indians reliant on this sector. Furthermore, India's economy is also heavily dependent on remittances from Indian workers abroad, many of whom reside in the U.S. If the U.S. economy crashes, the flow of money back into India could diminish significantly, leaving families struggling and potentially pushing more people into poverty. It is doubtful whether India could handle such a shock, especially considering its fragile economic balance. Number 5. Turkey. Have you ever considered how a U.S. recession could devastate Turkey? The interconnection between Turkey and the American economy is significant, and the potential impact is shocking. Turkey's economy is already fragile, grappling with high inflation and a weakening currency. It stands as one of the countries highly vulnerable to economic collapse should the U.S. enter a recession. How could this unfold? Turkey's export market is heavily reliant on the U.S. for a range of goods, from textiles to machinery. An economic downturn in the U.S. would reduce demand for Turkish products, potentially sending the country's export-driven industries into a tailspin. However, this is just the beginning. Turkey also depends significantly on foreign investments to maintain economic stability. During a global recession, American investors would likely withdraw their capital. This could lead to a sudden devaluation of the Turkish lira, pushing already high inflation even higher. One might think Turkey's strategic location between Europe and Asia would help it weather economic downturns. However, the country's reliance on American trade, capital, and tourism means it could spiral into even deeper financial chaos. Consider the consequences when inflation skyrockets, unemployment rises sharply, and public discontent reaches a boiling point. Turkey could face a severe economic crisis, carrying the potential for significant political instability. Whether Turkey can survive without substantial U.S. economic engagement is far from clear. Number 4. Argentina. Have you ever pondered how a country with a history of economic struggles could fare even worse during a global downturn? Argentina serves as a prime example of what can occur when an economic giant like the US enters a recession. The degree to which Argentina depends on external factors for its survival is alarming. Argentina's economy has been in turmoil for years, marked by inflation soaring over 100% and a continuously devaluing peso. Despite these challenges, the country still relies heavily on exports such as soybeans, oil, and wheat, many of which are destined for the U.S. market. If the U.S. faces a recession, global demand for these commodities would likely plummet, potentially causing Argentina's already fragile economy to collapse completely. While one might assume a country like Argentina has mechanisms to cope, its reliance on external trade and substantial foreign debt makes it extremely vulnerable. Consider the scenario where Argentina's ability to repay its loans is compromised. With U.S. banks tightening lending criteria during a recession, it could become nearly impossible for Argentina to secure necessary loans, potentially leading to a sovereign debt crisis. This economic disaster could trigger hyperinflation and widespread social unrest as the government might default on its obligations. Argentina's situation resembles a ticking time bomb, and a U.S. recession could initiate the chain reaction that sends it into even deeper financial turmoil. This isn't merely an isolated potential event. Countries around the world could be drawn into the chaos originating from such instability. Number 3. Saudi Arabia. Can you envision a scenario where Saudi Arabia, the economic powerhouse of the Middle East, crumbles due to a U.S. recession? It is quite startling how deeply Saudi Arabia's economy depends on the U.S. market. Saudi Arabia's oil exports constitute over 90% of its governmental revenue, and the U.S. has historically been one of the kingdom's largest customers. Now, consider what happens when the U.S. faces an economic downturn and oil demand consequently takes a nosedive. If the U.S. significantly cuts back on oil imports due to a weakened economy, Saudi Arabia would lose a substantial portion of its revenue. This is merely the tip of the iceberg. With falling oil prices, Saudi Arabia's entire financial system could face immense pressure, potentially leading to a crash. You might think Saudi Arabia could rely on its vast financial reserves to weather the storm, but oil isn't just its main export, it forms the backbone of the entire economy. Without a steady and substantial flow of revenue from oil sales, Saudi Arabia could face a massive financial crisis. Picture a kingdom that has invested billions in projects aimed at diversifying its economy, only to see those efforts potentially undermined by external shocks. Consider the potential consequences if unemployment spikes and social unrest begins to mount. Saudi Arabia could find itself facing a crisis of unimaginable proportions. Number 2. Nigeria. Have you ever wondered how a country possessing such vast natural resources could potentially crumble under the weight of a global recession? Nigeria is one such nation, and the prospect of a U.S. recession could represent a critical tipping point. The extent to which Nigeria relies on global trade, particularly its oil exports, to maintain its economy is substantial and concerning. Herein lies the critical vulnerability. Nigeria's economy is extremely susceptible to the fluctuations of the global oil market. Oil constitutes more than 90% of Nigeria's export revenue, and a significant portion of these exports traditionally goes to the U.S. market. Consequently, when the U.S. faces a recession and its demand for oil drops, Nigeria's economy would experience an immediate and severe impact. Without the robust cash flow from oil exports, the Nigerian government could struggle to fund essential public services, potentially triggering an economic crisis that could send the country into chaos. One might think Nigeria's oil wealth offers protection, but in reality, it intrinsically ties the nation's fate to the volatile global oil market. The issues do not end there. Nigeria also contends with extreme poverty, high unemployment rates, and political instability. A recession in the U.S. would exacerbate these existing problems, especially since many Nigerian families rely heavily on remittances sent from workers abroad, including those in the U.S. If the U.S. economy weakens, these crucial financial lifelines could diminish, plunging families further into poverty. The potential ripple effect across the country includes fewer jobs, higher inflation, and a growing sense of unrest. In essence, a U.S. recession could plunge Nigeria into a full-blown economic disaster. Given its fragile infrastructure, political instability, and overwhelming reliance on oil, the country might struggle immensely to recover. This situation raises the critical question: could this be the breaking point for Africa's most populous nation? The potential answer is deeply concerning. Number 1. China. Have you ever paused to consider how the world's second-largest economy might be affected by a U.S. recession? China, which has experienced decades of rapid economic growth, could find itself in serious trouble. The reality of its vulnerability is quite shocking. China is heavily dependent on the United States for its manufacturing output and exports. In fact, China exports nearly $450 billion worth of goods to the United States annually. What happens if this crucial trade lifeline is significantly disrupted? In the event of a U.S. recession, American consumer demand for Chinese goods would likely plummet. China's manufacturing sector, the engine driving its economy, would consequently suffer a severe slowdown. This could trigger widespread consequences: rising unemployment, factory closures, and an overall deceleration in economic growth. It's not merely the potential loss of the U.S. market that poses a concern. China is also heavily reliant on American investments. If U.S. companies withdraw investments due to global economic uncertainty, the financial impact could be catastrophic for China's economy. This is only part of the picture. China is already grappling with a massive debt crisis, characterized by skyrocketing corporate debt levels. The Chinese government and businesses have borrowed extensively, and a recession would make servicing this substantial debt even more challenging. Consider this scenario. A country that has thrived on rapid expansion is suddenly hit with an economic crisis, struggling to manage mounting debts while simultaneously dealing with a shrinking economy. The sustainability of China's economy under such pressure is a significant question. Furthermore, a recession in the U.S. would also translate to reduced global demand for China's exports. Countries around the world would likely tighten their spending, reducing their consumption of Chinese-made products. The result would be even less business for China's manufacturers and further strain on an already fragile economic situation. What occurs when an economic powerhouse like China begins to falter? A global shift in economic power could be on the horizon. If China cannot recover effectively, it could leave the country scrambling to find its footing in a rapidly changing global landscape. With rising debt, weakening demand, and pervasive uncertainty ahead, China's future might not be as secure as it once appeared. It is clear that the economic instability potentially caused by a U.S. recession could bring devastating consequences for some of the world's major economies. From oil-dependent nations like Saudi Arabia and Nigeria, to global manufacturing hubs, like China, the potential ripple effects are undeniable. The crucial question remains whether these countries possess the resilience to withstand such a shock, or if they might collapse under the immense pressure. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with others. We're committed to bringing you more content like this, and your support helps us continue to provide eye-opening insights into global economics. Stay tuned for more, and remember to hit that bell for notifications on future videos. Thanks for watching.